Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're joining us today. Now, right off the bat, you might notice something, well, kind of quirky about our style today. We're using this fun animated elbow macaroni theme to map out something that is honestly incredibly complex. Today, we're diving into this completely wild contrast between a super short conflict from back in 1898 and the massive, enduring geopolitical hangover it left us with in the year 2026. We are talking about the Spanish-American War. Literally just a 10-week conflict, but man, we are still dealing with the fallout well over a century later.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer ironity of those four words. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay famously dubbed this a splendid little war, and, for the politicians of the time, it probably seemed exactly like that, fast, victorious, and with relatively low American casualties. But calling a war that absolutely dismantled an entire global empire and birthed a brand new one little? Yeah, that's got to be one of the biggest historical understatements of all time. So we're going to unpack the massive, really complex legacy this so-called little war actually left behind.
So here's our roadmap for the Explainer today. First, we'll look at the ingredients of war. Then, the global blitz. Third, the spoils of war. And finally, number 4, that 2026 imperial legacy.
All right, let's dive right into part 1, the ingredients of war. What actually sparked this 1898 conflict?
Okay, so picture this. There is a massive amount of tension brewing just south of the United States. Basically, 3 highly volatile ingredients got mixed together to light the match. First up, the Cuban Rebellion. Cubans had been fighting for independence from the Spanish Empire for years, and reports of these brutal Spanish re-concentration camps started hitting the U.S., which sparked some serious public outrage. Second ingredient? Yellow journalism. You had these mega media moguls, guys like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, pumping out highly sensationalized and, frankly, often completely fabricated headlines just to sell papers. They literally whipped the American public into a pro-war frenzy. And then, the third and final spark, the horrific explosion of the USS Maine on February 15, 1898, right in Havana Harbor, tragically killing 266 sailors. You put those 3 things together, and the American public was absolutely primed for a fight.
When the USS Maine went down, it sent absolute shockwaves across the country. The press jumped all over it immediately, pointing the finger at a Spanish mine, which gave birth to that incredibly catchy, rhyming battle cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Now actually, scratch that. Modern evidence strongly points to an internal coal bunker fire, not a Spanish attack at all. But, back in 1898, the truth honestly didn't matter quite as much as a gripping headline. The public demanded action, and, well, they got it.
Moving on to part 2, the global blitz, a true two-front war.
What's crazy is that this war was executed with almost unbelievable speed and across 2 entirely different oceans. Over in the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey sailed his naval squadron right into Manila Bay and just systematically destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet, and he pulled us off in a matter of hours, with 0 American lives lost. An absolutely bloodless naval victory, which is just wild. Meanwhile, on the exact opposite side of the globe, in Cuba, you've got the land war. This is where the legendary Rough Riders, that famous volunteer cavalry led by Theodore Roosevelt, charged right up San Juan Hill. That specific charge became a massive piece of American mythology, and it absolutely catapulted Roosevelt straight toward the presidency.
That brings us to part 3, the spoils of war, and the Treaty of Paris in 1898.
So after merely 10 weeks of fighting, the Spanish Empire basically just collapsed. Let's walk through the territorial spoils step by step because these are absolutely crucial to understanding our world map today. Step 1, Cuba gained its independence. But notice the air quotes there. While they were technically free from Spain, the U.S. essentially forced in this thing called the Platt Amendment, which gave America the permanent right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Step 2, the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico were officially handed over to the United States. And step 3, the Philippines weren't just simply ceded over. They were actually sold by Spain to the U.S.
So what was the price tag for an entire archipelago and millions of people? $20 million. And honestly, that number is just staggering when you think about the human cost that came next. See, the Filipino people had just helped the U.S. defeat Spain, so they fully expected their independence. When they realized they had essentially just been bought by a new colonial master, they rebelled. That $20 million transaction directly sparked the Filipino-American War. And that was a conflict that ended up being vastly longer, way more difficult, and significantly bloodier than the quick 10-week war with Spain ever was.
Let's see how this all builds together, because the aftermath really left a complicated legacy for the key players involved. You've got President William McKinley and Rough Rider Theodore Roosevelt, who basically rode this massive wave of expansion straight into a new era of American global power. On the flip side, you have figures like Spanish General Valeriano Weyler, horrifyingly nicknamed the Butcher, who left behind a really dark legacy of suffering. And then, so tragically, you have the Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo. He really represents the devastating human cost of this era. He bravely fought alongside the U.S. to kick out Spain, only to be forced to turn right around and fight the United States for his own country's right to exist.
Which leads us right into Part 4, the 2026 perspective, an imperial legacy.
Okay, so the decisions made during those 10 little weeks, they fundamentally built the geopolitical map we are living with right now. 1898 was the ultimate turning point for the United States. Before this, the U.S. practice was called continentalism, meaning it was mostly a regional power, pretty much entirely focused on expanding and managing its own borders within North America. But 1898, that was the birth of American imperialism. For the very first time, the U.S. was out there actively governing overseas territories with absolutely zero intention of ever admitting them as equal states. The country fundamentally transformed overnight from a regional power into a massive global player with permanent interests in Asia and the Caribbean.
And this huge transformation birthed what historians called the Roosevelt effect. The war totally propelled Theodore Roosevelt into power, and his famous big stick diplomacy really set this aggressive, outward-facing tone that ended up defining the entire 20th century. It basically launched the American century. But here we are in 2026. As our world keeps navigating this incredibly complex multipolar power structure, the rules of that American century, rules born straight out of that 1898 conflict, are being actively challenged, tested, and reassessed on the global stage every single day.
So the crucial point is that this history isn't just stuck in the past. It is actively playing out right now in our legislature. Just look at the unresolved status of Puerto Rico. Acquired as a spoil of war 128 years ago, Puerto Rico's political destiny is still one of the most heavily debated topics in the U.S. Congress today. Should it stay a commonwealth? Should it be granted full statehood? Or should it be given complete independence? These are massive legal and political questions that have sat completely unresolved since 1898, and they are still at the absolute center of modern political discourse in 2026.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought to close out our explainer today. 128 years after a splendid little war that lasted merely 10 weeks, the echoes are still deafening. How will the unresolved status of territories like Puerto Rico, combined with this ongoing global reassessment of the American century, reshape our geopolitical map next? Let me tell you, the hangover of 1898 is far from over. I really encourage you to keep questioning this legacy, keep looking at the map, and keep seeking to understand how our past is quite literally governing our future. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this fascinating piece of history. Catch you next time.